it's a medical scandal waiting in the wings. This country is very good at talking about how it cherishes children, and then is allowing this, as I say, unscientific mass psychological experiment to take place, which can lead to really profound consequences for the young people involved. No child can consent to treatment that they don't understand.
Hello, welcome back to Gript. I'm your host, Fatima Gunning, and joining me in the studio today I have Sandra Adams of the Countess. Sandra, can you tell us a little bit about the Countess for people who aren't aware with your work?
Yes, the Countess is a non-profit human rights organisation. We're a company limited by guarantee, and we are a group of volunteers who are trying to draw attention to the unintended negative consequences of a piece of legislation called the Gender Recognition Act. It was passed in 2015, and this piece of legislation has profound impacts on the rights of women, children, safeguarding, and on society in general. So we're a single issue organisation.
And we've spoken to your colleague Leisha de Bruin quite extensively about the gender ideology coming into the school curriculum, the transgender ideology in particular. Can you kind of update us a bit on where that's at right now?
Okay, so we all know that in 2 weeks, roughly, children are going to return to school. And what we're looking at in secondary school is a mass psychological experiment is about to be performed on children returning in first, second and third year, because of a new curriculum, the Social, Personal and Health Educational Curriculum, SPHE. And that curriculum has been revised in the last 2 years. There was a public consultation and they had over 4,000 submissions from parents and organisations on the content of that new curriculum. That new curriculum is going to teach young people that gender identity is a fact, that we all have a gender identity regardless of whether or not we say we don't. And that has profound implications because of the harm that it can do.
And terms like gender identity, gender ideology, transgender ideology, these are very, very new words. So for people who are not very familiar with them, like people who don't engage with maybe the social media too much, can you kind of give a rundown of what they mean?
Okay, so gender identity is a theory, okay? It's not based in science, it's highly contested. And gender identity is a belief, and it states that an individual has an internal sense of themselves as being male, female, neither, or both. And so if I use myself as an example, I'm female, I'm an adult human female, I'm a woman. I don't have a gender identity. And I would be considered, because I don't have any incongruence, or I don't feel uncomfortable being a woman, I don't think I'm a man, I don't think I'm neither man or woman, I would be considered to be cisgender because my internal sense of self aligns with my physical body. Now, the fact that I say I don't have a gender identity is ignored, and I would still be called cisgender by those who believe in this ideology. So what happens is, for a young person, if they feel any sense of discomfort about themselves, or they're awkward, if they're very impressionable, they can easily be diverted into thinking that that sense of awkwardness that we all have when we're an adolescent is actually proof or a symptom that their gender identity, their internal sense of themselves, doesn't actually match up with their physical body, and that they can take steps to bring those things into alignment. And what they can be encouraged to do is to maybe socially transition. So they would change their name, maybe change their pronouns. So instead of me being addressed as Sandra, she, her, they're my pronouns, you would address me by my new name. And let's say I wanted to call myself John. And you would have to use male pronouns. So you would have to call me he or him when you were referring to me if I wasn't there. So it's quite, it can have profound impacts for children who are quite vulnerable, because we all know what it's like not to feel comfortable. And what you do in that situation, if a child comes to you and says, I think my gender identity doesn't align with my body, or I've been born in the wrong body, you don't affirm it. You hold them very neutrally and you hold them lightly, because 80% of young people who claim to have a gender identity that doesn't line up with their physical body, if they're just supported and not directed in any way, they grow out of it.
And up until 10 minutes ago, essentially, this would have been called gender dysphoria, is that correct?
Yes, so gender dysphoria is a condition that normally would start in very young childhood, and there's a phrase: consistent, insistent and persistent. So gender dysphoria is listed in the Diagnostic Statistics Manual of psychiatric conditions, but it's very rare. It's very, very rare. What we're seeing is something completely different. It's called rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ODG. And this phrase was coined by Dr. Lisa Littman about 3 or 4 years ago. And what she saw was that there was this explosion of adolescents claiming, believing that they had been born in their own body. So young women who were now identifying as boys and boys identifying as girls. And what has happened is many more young girls are now identifying out of their sex and claiming a non-binary identity or a male identity.
And are there any clues as to why it's specifically girls?
Well, I suppose if you think about what happens when young women reach adolescence, the experience of young women can be quite a shock to go from being a girl and being quite carefree to coming into what is essentially womanhood, and your body starts to change. You grow breasts, your hips widen, you physically change, and also how the world interacts with you starts to change. So you start to realize that men looking at you differently, and maybe start to feel objectified, that they're no longer an individual. And young women seem to have, even though we're told we can do anything and we can be anything, there seem to be actually very limited options. You can be very glamorous or not. And there doesn't seem to be anything kind of in between. And so if you're just presented with these choices, what if you're just a very sporty girl who isn't really into, fashion and makeup? Gender identity actually relies on very strong stereotypes, that if you don't like things that girls should like, maybe you're not a girl. And if you don't like things that boys like, maybe you're not a boy. And that's very difficult if, let's say, you are an effeminate boy who's gay, okay? Because essentially you're being told, well, maybe you're not a boy at all. You might be same-sex attracted, but maybe you're actually not a boy. You're actually a girl. So
you're not gay, you're just a girl in a boy's body.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly, yeah. So you can understand how young people, how teenagers can be seduced by this, because it's an immediate fix. If you're feeling distressed or you're feeling awkward and someone says to you, if you do this, everything will be solved. You will gain status in your group. You will be celebrated as brave. But what it demands is that everyone has to participate in order for that to succeed. And that's when young people come up against the reality of it, because many people won't participate. And then that's when there's tension and conflict, because there are still adults who will say, no one can change sex. You're still my daughter. You're still my son. I'm not going to use the new name. I'm not going to use the new pronouns. And that's when the tension begins.
And just to come back to your point about the kind of the narrow window of what is female and what's accepted as female in the media, and I think social media undoubtedly, I would say, has a huge impact on those kind of adolescent kids. But I remember clearly Chloe Cole, who was a girl who unfortunately had a double mastectomy at 15 years old in the US. She said that when she was growing up, she was looking at pictures of Kim Kardashian, who, like, every adult knows Kim Kardashian has had a truckload of surgery. Like, that's not her real body shape to a certain extent. But Chloe was thinking, I'm kind of square. I don't have much going on, like, in terms of curves. I'm not a very good girl. Maybe I do better as a boy. And then the lack of an adult telling her, actually, no, Chloe, you're just a little skinny.
Yeah.
Led that poor girl into having a double mastectomy.
Yes. there seems to be a real absence of adult intervention here. You know, women, young girls don't need to be told that they can be right, they can be the right sort of girl if they just stop being a girl. They need to be told that there's a range of ways to be female, okay? You can be a very masculine woman. That doesn't make you a man. And you can be a hyper feminine woman. You're still female. And there seems to be, you know, a very limited window, like you say. There's only certain ways to be female. And that is very, very difficult for young girls. Because if you don't see role models, and if women of all types aren't celebrated, then it's not surprising that they're going to think they're not the right sort of woman, that they don't reach the mark. And then gender identity can kind of hijack that and push them into thinking, well, actually, maybe I'd be a more successful boy than I am a successful girl.
And you were saying, just off camera when we were having a chat, you were saying that in this curriculum, the kind of the transgenderism is presented as, it's almost like it's being advertised where they don't discuss the possible negatives of what can happen. No. Can we talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So gender identity is being presented in the SPHE curriculum as fact. So there was a 2-year consultation by the NCCA, that's the National Council for Curriculum Assessment, who will design and assess all curriculum. They asked for input on what should be in this new social, personal and health curriculum. And when they produced the draft curriculum, it stated in Learning Outcome 1.4 that gender identity is a core part of what it means to be human. It also stated that sex was on a spectrum. It referred to people as being cisgendered. So what I spoke about earlier about if your internal sense of self aligns with your physical body, that makes you a cis woman or a cis man. And they also spoke about non-binary. Now, when that draft curriculum was published, there was a lot of pushback from parents. Before it was published, over 4,000 parents and organisations contributed to the public consultation on the curriculum. That's unprecedented. I don't think the NCCA has ever had that level of engagement. And what's really disappointing is that that level of engagement was framed very negatively by the NCCA. They described the input as petition-style communications, which begs the question, is there ever any way to legitimately express your dissatisfaction with public policy without it being framed as some type of orchestrated attempt to undermine progress?
Right, and the government also used the same line, I believe, in regards to the submission on the hate speech
Exactly.
bill. It's like, no, it's not individuals being uncomfortable, it's just some kind of like some guys in a basement somewhere.
Exactly, that there's...
it's not legitimate.
It's not legitimate. And we know from the Countess, we produced a very useful template for people to make, if they agreed with us, if they agreed that they thought there were problems with this curriculum, to submit that. Because most people have never made a public submission to policy document in their life. They don't know how. And it's very arrogant to frame, using a grassroots tool in that manner, that everyone who's made a submission is some type of crank. They're parents who want to input into the education of their children. That's what you invited them to do, and then you tell them that it's not the right type of input. So just back to the question you asked about gender identity in the curriculum. So the NCCA did modify the final curriculum, and it no longer says that gender identity is a core part of what it means to be human, and they've removed sex is on a spectrum. Unfortunately, some of the publishers who have produced SPHE textbooks didn't get the memo, because they are still stating these things in the textbooks. Folens, EDCO and Educate.ie have all produced new textbooks to support the delivery of the junior cycle SPHE. And we should point out, this is just junior cycle, okay? It hasn't the senior cycle SPHE is being reviewed at the moment. So the books that are being used are using some of the most ideologically driven graphics, the genderbread person, the sexuality wheel, still referring to cisgender and non-binary, even though those words have been removed from the glossary in the final curriculum draft. So it's very worrying that the publishers don't seem to be in alignment with what is actually in the curriculum. Now, I think the NCCA have allowed that to happen, whether deliberately or not. Once they allow gender identity to go into the curriculum as an element of what makes up a human being, they basically then open the gate to allow the publisher to say what they like about gender identity.
Where does this gender ideology stuff actually come from?
It's a very good question. It's quite complicated, I think. I think its roots are in queer theory. Queer theory is a very niche, or at least it was a very niche branch of I suppose, the humanities, of the social sciences. And essentially queer theory demands that we break down all boundaries, that there should be no categorizations, because in queer theory, any attempt to place limits around things is oppressive. And you could say, well, you know, there's merit in always challenging and asking why certain things are the way they are, okay, and engaging your kind of critical mind. But there are boundaries around certain things for very good reason. There's age boundaries, there's, until very recently, boundaries around sex. And when you break those boundaries, chaos ensues. So queer theory has really informed what is happening in the SPHE curriculum, and it will inform what's going to happen in the senior cycle curriculum. We can see it happening. So queer theory essentially is the idea that all boundaries are oppressive and need to be broken. And when you break them, you break everything.
And if I can kind of move back to the framing of this issue with particular focus on the media, parents who are concerned about certain books being aimed at like young teens and preteens, they seem to be consistently labelled as far right or homophobic. Can you what do you say to that? Is this a partisan issue? Is it something everybody should be concerned about?
I think everyone should be concerned about it. I think when you call everybody far right, you run the risk of not being able to identify who is truly extreme. And if you don't allow people to speak, you don't allow people to think. And it's when we speak, we think, we hear ourselves, and that's when we might change our mind or modify our view, or come to the realization that, yeah, actually, I think I'm on pretty solid ground here. Parents who are advocating for their children are not extremists. There seems to be a concerted effort to sideline parents, as if parents are this nuisance who are, you know, obstructing progress. A parent is the best advocate for their child. They're the strongest advocate for their child. Parents' rights are in education, definitely are very secure. We are considered the primary educators of our children. We have statutory rights. So parents need to step in to their authority and state very calmly, but very firmly, that they don't want their children taught things that they don't believe. That's not a crank. That's not someone who's extreme. It's someone who is expressing their and asking for vindication of their right as a parent.
And how should they take those steps? Like, does it have to start with legal letters, or can it be something as simple as a group of parents just getting together and be like, look, we don't like this, and approaching the school principal?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to address it. You know, probably questioning is actually the best way to get answers. So if you're concerned about a book that's being used to teach your child SPHE, you can simply ask the school, on what basis was the book chosen? You can point out parts of the book that you have concerns about. So if it's the SPHE book that has the genderbread person in it, you can ask them, well, can you explain to me, what does this graphic mean? And you may find that the teacher actually doesn't know because they haven't actually investigated it. I think when you ask questions, like I said, you get people to think.
And the genderbread person is the cartoon where there's a female brain and a male brain.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So it's this. It looks very benign. I call it the despicable biscuit. The genderbread person is like the genderbread man, and it has a brain that kind of goes in a wash of colour from pink to blue. And it has where the genitalia should be the symbols for the medical symbols for male, female, and then another symbol that has both. That could be interpreted as non-binary identity, trans identity. But it's giving the impression that there's more than two sets of genitals.
Again,
that you can be both. Yeah. That you can be both. It never names body parts. It never mentions male or female. So it de-sexes the human body, and it can hijack a child's understanding of their anatomy. I think it's also very strange the internal incoherence of teaching this in a school where you might be teaching biology. Imagine if you're the SPHE teacher and you're teaching gender identity in one class and then you're going in to teach biology in the next lesson to the same students. You've just told them in this lesson that, sex is essentially a decision. You can choose your sex. And then over here in biology, you're teaching them about human reproduction and that there are only two sexes. How does human reproduction work within gender identity? So how are teachers, feel quite sorry for teachers, how are they meant to manage that incoherence? If you're teaching physics, there are principles that apply, gravity is one of them. How do you teach that gravity is real, but sex isn't? So it really presents teachers, I think, with significant issues, but teachers don't seem to be receiving any guidance from their unions. They don't seem to be confident enough to actually, again, just say, I have concerns about this. How does this impact children's welfare? And how does it impact our capacity to teach and be taken seriously? Because teenagers aren't fools. They can tell when somebody's peddling nonsense. I think it really undermines the authority of a teacher and the authority of the teaching profession when they're being asked to tell blatant untruths, unscientific, highly contested, and they have to go into the classroom and pass it off as the truth.
And in terms of the harms that can be caused by this ideology, I think we know that there's been no risk assessment done of what harms this can actually cause to young people and adolescents. But is there a situation where a school could be held legally responsible if any harm occurs?
Well, that's a good question. I think that can only be assessed if a case is taken. But let's say, for example, a school introduces mixed-sex toilets. Now, that is a policy within the Department of Education. All new build secondary schools basically have one architectural plan, and you can modify it a little bit. But within the plan, the image that is shown for the toilet blocks are mixed sex. Now, we've had extensive engagement with the Department of Education trying to get some definitive answer on this. Are schools required to do it, or do they have any option? And, it's very difficult to get a straight answer from the department. But I know anecdotally, and I know personally, that a school can introduce mixed-sex toilets. When you say to them, I want to see the risk assessment and I want to see the impact assessment, you will be told that has been conducted by the Department of Education. You need to go there to get that answer. We know the Department of Education hasn't produced an impact assessment or risk assessment on the use of mixed-sex toilets in secondary schools. It hasn't been done. All public bodies have a statutory duty to ensure that their policies ensure equality for all. And they are meant to assess risk and impact before they do anything. I guarantee you there is no risk assessment or impact assessment on the introduction of mixed-sex toilets into schools or gender ideology into schools. They just haven't done it.
And on the point of parents having the right to simply take their kids out of the lessons, does that actually stop the gender ideology from reaching them? Surely if they're still mixing with their peers, it'll get to them anyway?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. You're in a bind there because if you remove your child, two things are happening. Like you say, the lesson is still being taught and everyone else is being exposed to it, but you've also marked your child as different. And the implication might be that your child or your family is transphobic or your family is bigoted. Bizarrely, that your family might be homophobic. If anything, I think people who are challenging gender ideology recognise it is inherently homophobic because it can tell young people who might be gay that they're actually
born in the wrong body. Yeah.
That the effeminate gay boy should be a girl and the butch lesbian should be a boy. So gender ideology can still have an impact on children. You know, the genie is out of the bottle. And I'm not 100% sure how we are going to address that now. But I think if you are going to teach young people about gender identity in schools, then you've got to talk to them about desisting and detransitioning. That is mentioned nowhere in any of the resources, in the SPHE textbook, on the NCCA website. It's as if those people don't exist.
And what does desisting mean?
Okay, so if a young person has a non-binary or trans identity, they may change their name and they may change their pronouns. That's called social transition. And so there's no medical intervention, there's no medication taken, there's no surgery. So a young person can maybe occupy that identity for a year or 6 months or however long, and then come to the realization, actually, you know what, I'm not the opposite sex, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, and maybe I was coming to terms with my nascent homosexuality, or I was just feeling awkward in my growing body. However they come to the conclusion that they don't have a non-binary or trans identity, they desist. Okay, so they go back to their birth name, they go back to their sex pronouns. Detransition is really serious because someone who medically transitions may have taken puberty blockers, which has profound implications for their health. They may have gone on cross-sex hormones, which also has profound implications for their health. They may even have undergone surgery. So for a young woman, that would mean having a double mastectomy. For a man, it would mean having penis and testicles removed. So this is it's very, very serious. And some people who go through the transition process, the medication and surgery, realise that they've made a mistake, and that's detransitioning. And the young woman you spoke about, Chloe Cole, is a case in point. She thought she was a boy. Nobody sat her down and supported her to think it through properly. And she's made life-altering decisions. She's changed her body in a way that can't be unchanged. Now, if you were going to talk to young people about gender identity and say that it's real, you must tell them about desisting and detransitioning, because that is real. That is happening. And those young people their experience deserves to be honoured. It has to be recognised.
And I wonder, like, because you see more and more detransitioners. Just off the top of my head, I can think of Michelle Zakinga in Canada. There's Richie Hearn in the UK. There's Chloe Cole we talked about, and there are more and more and more. So, and I also know that there's a bad law project that's been set up by a group of lawyers in the UK who are trying to just tackle this. Yeah. I should mention again that like the kids who went through transition as young people, who like some of them are now adults, some of them are still teenagers, they are suing the people who led them down that road of transition, like the medics or whoever prescribed them the puberty blockers. Is this not a ticking time bomb?
Absolutely, it's a medical scandal waiting in the wings. You know, this country is very good at talking about how it cherishes children, and then is allowing this, as I say, unscientific mass psychological experiment to take place, which can lead to really profound consequences for the young people involved. No child can consent to treatment that they don't understand. A young person might not necessarily understand, or at the time doesn't necessarily care about the possibility that they may be infertile, because most teenagers aren't thinking about having a family. Okay, they're living in the moment, and that moment might actually be very stressful for them. They can't think ahead. And that's why we as adults and parents are there to guide them and to say, well, sometimes you might want to make a decision, but we know from experience that that's probably not the best thing to do. Parents, not all parents, but some parents seem to have stepped away from that. Certainly some teachers seem to have stepped away from that. Our policymakers have definitely stepped away from that, being the guide rails that protect children. So I think it's quite possible that we will end up with a situation where a school or a counsellor or a medic is going to end up being sued because a child cannot consent to these procedures, and informed consent isn't really worth the paper it's written on, and that means that medics and anyone who's involved in this, counsellors, schools, they will say, well, look, we talked through this with the child and the child was informed. Being informed doesn't mean you understand. And how can a 14-year-old understand the implications of radical surgery or taking medication that's going to render them infertile? So I think we will see a situation where it will end up in the courts. I wish it wasn't going to happen. I wish our politicians would step up and say, okay, we just need to stop here, halt, and we need to have a discussion about it. Talking about it doesn't make you a bigot. Talking about it doesn't make you an authoritarian. You're engaging your critical brain and you want other people to engage with you and try and come to some solution that protects everybody.
And Sandra, why is it that the Irish government seem to be going full steam ahead with this when we know that countries like Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, France and the UK have all abandoned this transitioning of kids?
Frankly, because the Irish government seems to be enthralled to lobby groups like TENI, the Transgender Equality Network of Ireland, and Belong To, and organisations like Amnesty International, which we would ordinarily assume would be preserving the rights of children and women, are completely captured as well. There is in our programme for government a commitment to advancing this ideology. And even though the HSE has sent young Irish people, children and teens, to the now discredited Tavistock Clinic in the UK, and that clinic, out of a review by a woman called Dr. Hilary Cass, has been seen to be entirely unfit for purpose. The HSE is still committed to transitioning children. It's happening because our government seems to be absolutely transfixed by the idea of being the best boy in the class. It's like the pendulum, we've had this overreach, we've swung too far from being, and we can argue whether or not we all agree with this, very a very restrictive country and not very progressive, right the way over, we've done 180 and we've gone too far. And I think the lure of being considered progressive and, dare I use the word woke, is so alluring to some politicians that they've completely disengaged with what it actually means to do these things. And that's very, very worrying. We know that nearly every politician in our parliament, in our Dáil, was sent a copy of Trans by Helen Joyce. I know I sent a copy to my local politician. My husband sent a copy to another local politician. We never got a response. And I think the majority of people who sent that book to their politician never got a response. So there's absolutely no way any politician in this country can say they do not know what is happening, that they don't know what the consequences of promoting gender ideology are, because we have told them over and over and over again. And we are presented as cranks, bigots, transphobic, homophobic, fascists, authoritarians, Nazis. We're individuals who have done the research, who've sat down and spent, in my case, 2.5 years pretty much reading nothing else, because I want to know and because I often doubt myself. And they're the people I think that are useful in a conversation, the people who don't always say, I'm absolutely right and there's no way I could be wrong. I'm constantly doubting, and that's why I'm constantly reading. That's what we do in the Countess. We research, and we don't make a statement until we know that we're on the money. And our politicians don't seem to have the same commitment to pursuing the facts.